Daniel Morales, and this is episode 53 of the How to Japanese podcast. It's July 2024. Otsukare-sama desu. July means that we have finally left the rainy season and the long, kind of moderate spring we had here behind, and it's just the brutal Japanese summer. It did feel like this year was a little bit almost chilly, especially during Golden Week and in parts of June, but now it's just the heat until October and November. So I hope you all are getting through it okay. Lots of Pocari Sweat and Eon water. I was over in Kyoto yesterday for Bit Summit, the Indie Games conference, and even just kind of getting to the venue was kind of like devastating in terms of the temperature. And I think at the end I had a little bit of like mild heat stroke or something. I really needed to recover and chill out and then get some more food and drink in me to revive myself. July is also the start of the second year of restarting this podcast. So I restarted it in July 2023 because I was paying for a podcast host and wasn't using it. And that kind of motivated me to get going again and at least put out something once a month. And it also corresponds to me rebooting my kanji study 3 years ago. So July is a bit of even though it's not a calendar year start or a fiscal year start, it's a new podcast year, a new point of beginning for me. Because 3 years ago I had been accepted to the Inter-University Center for Japanese Language Studies in Yokohama and was getting ready to start the curriculum in the fall. We had gotten like some kind of orientation materials. And so I had gotten started on that. And one of the things I knew about the program is that it included a review of all of the Joyo kanji, which are the common use kanji. There are 2,136 of them that are kind of established as the common use kanji. There are a lot more, obviously, that are in regular use for especially names, but even just in writing and things like that. But if you get these core kanji down, you'll have a really good start, I think, to doing Japanese. At IUC, the kanji are paced over the course of the 10 months of the program, and that enables us to do a kind of quick calculation. 10 months is about 300 days, and there are 2,136 of these Joyo kanji, which means about 7 a day if you were kind of doing it every single day. But the lessons are kind of grouped into sets of 10 or 20. And because the tests are cumulative, you have to keep reviewing the ones that you've already learned because they'll be on these kind of periodic review tests and on the final test. I wanted as much of a head start as I could get before the program because I knew it was going to be really intense. And so I started that summer. And it definitely helped. It gave me a little bit of a head start when I got going and made it not easy, but made it more survivable along with the rest of the material in the course. The hardest part is when the kanji jump from 10 to 20 in the set, and there's no kind of warning about this. It just happens especially towards the end when the kanji are already getting harder, more difficult, and suddenly you've got to do twice as many if in a set if you're doing one set a day. But luckily, I had given myself enough of a head start that it wasn't too painful. Unfortunately, though, last year I wrote, kind of an update after 2 years of doing mostly through Anki, but also kind of writing out kanji and kind of restructuring my kanji study around the IUC program. I wrote about what I thought about it, and definitely worth going to look at that post. But over this last year, unfortunately, I have not maintained my Anki deck at all. So this is not a kind of very celebratory anniversary, unfortunately. I've only logged in to the app when I get the warning from Anki via email that tells me my decks are about to be deleted. If you're not active for a certain amount of period on Anki on any of your decks, it will delete all of your online saved data. So it won't delete the data on your app. That's saved locally, obviously. But the great thing about Anki is that it syncs to Anki Web. So it will sync to all of the platforms you have Anki on. So you can use Anki on your desktop or your iPhone. I think it's free on the desktop. The iPhone app, I think, is $25. But if you log in and create an account, your decks will all sync online. And if you don't use them for long enough, Anki Web will delete that content. And I don't know if that deletes it from your phone, actually. That's maybe a good question that somebody else will have to look into. But one thing I do know is that you can create a manual backup, which is probably a good idea to do at certain points pretty regularly. In order to do this, you would go to the desktop version of the app, go to File, Export, and then make sure to include the Include Media box is ticked so that it'll back up any images and sounds attached to your flashcards. And then save it somewhere you'll be able to find it, somewhere safe and reliable like Dropbox, and preferably a kind of very clearly labeled folder like Anki backup or something like that, where you're not going to be like kind of desperately searching for it amongst a giant pile of files. And then the one last recommendation I make there is that the default name for your Anki file is just collection, but I would say you probably need to rename that to something that's going to remind you what it is. So Anki backup or something like that. But let me get back to the main point here, which I pretty clearly tried to distract you from, which is that my written kanji practice has languished, and I've kind of paid the price for it. I just did about 20 flashcards to kind of see where I was, and I only managed to write out a handful of them and felt pretty embarrassed. I will say that I was able to write ago correctly, which I was pretty proud of because it's not the easiest kanji. And there were a couple others where I was pretty close, just missing a few strokes here or there. So I looked back at what I wrote in the newsletter last year to kind of see if I still had the same opinion, and I listened to the podcast that I put out at the same time, and thought about whether I needed to kind of like reconsider anything that I had written about. By and large, I think everything that I wrote, all the recommendations that I gave they hold up pretty well. I think it's really critical to find ways to make your kanji study active rather than passive. Kanji study is generally something where people are like looking at a kanji and then seeing whether they understand the reading for it and the meaning for it. That's fine. It's slightly active, but it's very passive. I shifted it up in a couple ways. My strategy was to flip the card so that it displays the meaning in English rather than the pronunciation in Japanese. That way, if in the normal deck you're kind of forced to actively recall the pronunciation, whereas the way that I was doing it, you're forced to actively recall not only the pronunciation but the kanji itself. So that's more bang for your buck, and I think will kind of strengthen your familiarity with the kanji and your memorization of them. My memory for the pronunciation of the kanji was much better. I remembered kind of more complex words like yuyo, which is Japanese word for postpone, and shoujo for symptom, even if I couldn't write them. So that's the good news, I think. It wasn't completely gone. But yeah, anything you can do to make your kanji practice more active throughout over the course of the many years you'll be doing kanji, I think is going to be a good thing. I also still believe that for most people, they really should commit to a single kanji deck for the duration of their studies. I think that's going to be really beneficial. The main reason is that it ensures complete coverage, independent of any other Japanese classes or college courses that you happen to be taking. Right. So I did a 4-year college course of Japanese, and even though it was all through basically the same teachers, I don't know if the coverage was necessarily like as complete as maybe as it could have been. And so it might be that you are responsible for ensuring your own complete kanji coverage, and you can do that by starting with a deck that has all of the kanji in it. And I linked to one in the post from last year that I recommend. I think it's also important to give yourself breaks, and that's something I wrote about last year as well. if you can't do it every day, I think that's fine. You shouldn't like force yourself to do it, especially if you're already at a kind of reasonable level of fluency in Japanese. I'm not sure if kanji repetitions is the most effective way to kind of keep studying the language. The other reason that committing to a kanji deck is great is because it's a way to limit your repetitions and new cards. And it ensures you'll really be mastering a set of information, and also letting yourself pause the addition of new cards if you want to reduce the number of daily repetitions, which again ties into the idea of not really like forcing yourself to do it if you don't want to. So to give you kind of the specifics about how this might work, say you've got a deck of the Joyo kanji, or the one that I recommended, and you've gotten through maybe the first 200, 300, 400 kanji, right? And it's starting to get like tough. You're doing your 200 repetitions every day, but adding new kanji feels really like a heavy burden. It feels like it's making your daily repetitions more difficult. What you can do is set the number of new cards to 0. And that way, you won't see any new kanji for as long as you have that setting enabled. And what will happen is you'll just see the repetitions of the kanji, of the cards, of the vocab that you already have introduced into that deck. And as those become more and more familiar, you'll extend out the time frame for the next repetition, right? So the next time you see the flashcard will go from 1 day to 3 days to 5 days to 14 days to 28 days. And as you push those out, your daily repetitions may go from 200 to like 100 to like 50. And then before you know it, you'll only have like 5 to 10 repetitions a day, which you'll be able to knock out in like 10, 15 minutes. And that's always a really good feeling, where you're kind of doing maintenance on your kanji study, on your flashcard study, right? And so okay, I've kind of mastered the content that I currently have. I can knock out my kanji repetitions. And maybe at that point, that's the time when you can start adding in new kanji to your practice. And I think that can be a really big relief, a relief valve if Anki has become this thing that you start to kind of dread. So, and then actually, if you think about it, like 200 repetitions is kind of what I was doing over the course of the IUC program. And if you break that down, that's probably around like 100 minutes of study. So if you think about maybe 30 seconds per repetition, that's what it would be, 100 minutes. And that's like over an hour and a half. You could maybe get it down to like 66 minutes if you're going at 20 seconds per repetition, if you think about it that way. But that's still an hour of kanji repetitions every day. And if you are doing a full-time job or have a heavy college course or both, do you really have an hour? So finding strategies that are going to provide a relief valve, that are going to allow you to add new kanji, master them, and then add more, rather than kind of maintaining this intense pressure of adding 10 new kanji every day. I think that's going to be critical for a lot of people going into a project like this. And so again, that's the benefit of committing to a deck, because you're going to be able to like build familiarity, reduce the number of daily repetitions before adding new cards. The one exception to maintaining a single deck might be if you know that you are a kind of rules-based, database-minded person and enjoy putting together decks. I don't think I do. I'm not really wired that way. I would have to see the way that somebody else does it, and then I would probably be able to model that, I think. I was good enough to find this deck and then be able to kind of like modify it, flip it so that it did what I needed to do. But I don't think I would have been kind of wired in the same way that of the person who put together this initial deck, which is somebody who clearly enjoyed kind of creating this database of information. If that's the way you're wired, then I would say go wild and do as many decks as you want to do. I think there is an argument for maintaining a deck of kind of phrases and sentences that you come across in daily life, so that you can master those phrases, especially if there's something that you'll find useful. I find that the phrases that I end up kind of saving and writing down are not quite daily use phrases. Like, for the most part, the daily use phrases, I've kind of gotten the ones that I need in my daily life. There's probably more that I could benefit from using, but the ones that I end up noting down are the kind of curious and interesting and useful phrases that I think might come in handy once in a blue moon, which maybe those aren't the ones that you would want to be adding to an Anki deck. I know that a lot of people have had a lot of success with that strategy, the strategy of kind of creating a conversational deck, maybe independent from your kanji deck. But yeah, I would say try and make it independent, because the kanji one I think I would want to keep on its own to make sure you're really going for completion there. But you do want to avoid the situation where you're spending more time creating, maintaining the deck, adding cards, than you are actually studying the deck. And you also, I think, want to avoid the situation where you're doing more time with Anki study rather than other language study out in the wild. I think I would prefer that students do anything, kind of watching anime, reading a book, talking to a Japanese friend, rather than doing Anki study. Thinking back to the podcast, I think there's one recommendation I would kind of adjust, and that is the goal of 50 kanji a week. I wonder if that's a little bit intense. I think that's what I recommended, and I don't think there's any reason why you couldn't have that amount and go for 25 a week. So my recommendation was to try and do all the Joyo kanji in a year, all 2,136 of them in a year. You could do them at 5 a day at that rate, but I felt like a realistic goal might be to go in with the intention of doing 50 a week, which would take 42 weeks and give you 10 weeks of kind of buffer time throughout the year. You know, that would be time when you could turn off new cards and master what you have for a week every month or so. So basically 10 weeks that's almost 1 week a month. So you could use 1 week a month to really kind of master and perfect what you have before adding new kanji or something like that, right? But I think I'd rather see people go at half that pace and take 2 years to go through the entire Joyo kanji. And that would give you just tons of extra time to be doing other Japanese study. That's, I think, the one critical part is that, yes, you'd be using some of that time you're not doing kanji study to be resting, but I think you'd hopefully be using most of that time to be reading, writing, and speaking Japanese in ways that are not SRS, flashcard repetition. And during that process, you're going to come across other kanji that you haven't looked up yet, and that's going to make the whole process a lot easier. So it really kind of builds into itself, the language study, right? And the more you do, the easier the Anki repetitions will become, because you're going to see these kanji out in the wild as well, right? And so the Anki deck is really just a foundation, a safety net, something that's going to give you an initial lift as you start to kind of read more, and it's going to make sure you see at least all of the Joyo kanji. I hinted at this in the podcast a little bit, and that was the idea that you really need to be prioritizing the type of study you do based on where you are in your studies at that time, which is why I don't feel quite so bad about giving up my Anki study a little bit. If your Japanese study stretches into multiple decades, and I wrote about this in the newsletter this month, it will go through different, what I call seasons. It's a bit kind of crazy for me to even think this, but my Japanese study is now in its 3rd decade, which is unreal. I've been studying Japanese longer than I've lived without studying Japanese. If your study stretches on this long, you're going to go through different obsessions, different focuses, different periods of study. And, during the early days, you're going to be focusing on hiragana and katakana, which is something that you're not going to be focusing on, later in your studies. And once you've mastered those, if you use an SRS Anki deck, you can just put it away. You don't need to feel bad about not doing hiragana flashcards or katakana flashcards. And I think that makes common sense. And I think that's probably true for kanji as well. I don't think there's any reason why it needs to be different. The degree of fluency is really what's key here, right? Until you reach a kind of reasonable degree of fluency, the only way to improve is to do some sort of substantial amount of Japanese study every day. After that point, it's not worth kind of cracking the whip, beating yourself up. Do what you want to do, just do it in Japanese. And kind of finding out what that is might actually be the hardest part. For me, for whatever reason, it happens to be reading Murakami, which is starting to get unfortunate given that his new novels aren't very good. But fortunately, his older stuff I think, still holds up. This month, I started preparing for my annual Murakami Fest blog posts. Ever since 2008, I've read Murakami that hasn't been translated into English and posted about it every week during September on my blog. And for the last few years, I've been looking at the book Distant Drums, which is Murakami's travel memoir from the 1980s. I find it incredibly easy just to kind of sit and focus on reading it for 5 to 10 pages at a time. It's not totally pain-free. I mean, even sitting and reading English for, 20, 30 pages is kind of difficult in the age of smartphones. And so doing so in a foreign language is, equally difficult, if not more difficult. But I don't know, Murakami, I just have this kind of like appetite for it that I don't have for other writers. And I don't understand every word, but I'm reading actively, looking up the ones that I don't know. And I enjoy doing that. And that's kind of what you should be looking for. What's going to come easy? What are you able to sit down and do? What's the opposite of kind of writhing in pain? You kind of necessarily have to go through so much pain during that initial investment in your Japanese. Once you get to a reasonable level, it's time to luxuriate in your fluency, I think. If that means watching anime, then do it. If that means reading manga, then do it. And if you haven't made it there yet, if you haven't made it to that kind of fluency that you can kind of luxuriate in, trust me, it's worth it. And I think you're probably closer than you think. And one little piece of Iro for this month, the New York Times did their 100 best books of the 21st century over about a week. They released 100 through 80, 80 through 60, 60 through 40, 20 a day for about a week. And it was pretty cool. It was cool to see what kind of books were being included, what the voters, what the judges were choosing, and also eventually what the readers picked. But one thing that was noticeable was that Murakami was not included. So none of his books, I think, were mentioned on the top 100 list. Of the judges that shared their ballots, one selected the colorless Tozaki Tsukuru and his Years of Pilgrimage, but no love for 1Q84 or Kafka on the Shore or After Dark or Killing Commendatore, which are Murakami's other 21st century novels. I think it's pretty clear Murakami's lost some of that cool factor that he had, early in the 2000s and in the 2010s. I couldn't say why, other than that maybe his novels aren't quite as sharp as they used to be. That's from my point of view. I know a lot of people still really love his books. In the reader poll, Kafka and 1Q84 came in 78th and 79th, so pretty low, I would say. I was thrilled to see Elena Ferrante and all her books included so high, and then also Roberto Bolaño. So there was some good translation represented. I don't think there were any other Japanese translations included, unfortunately. But yeah, that was just an interesting note. Go check it out for yourself. I've got links in the newsletter, and let me know what you think in the comments. That's all I've got for you this month. So a little bit of a shorter podcast than normal. This marks 2 months in a row with a kind of motivational, non-linguistic content. So next month I'll have something a little bit more meatier, spicier for you in terms of specific language recommendations that will hopefully be useful. So definitely stay tuned in for next week or next month. And just a note that Google Podcasts shut down, I believe. So I moved my RSS feed over to YouTube in case that's a platform that you use regularly. Definitely look over there, and they'll be online just about the same time as the other platforms. You'll always find me on Apple and other podcast platforms. And if there's somewhere you can't find How to Japanese, please let me know, and I'll see what I can do to get it online there. One final note, I started listening to my podcast, not a How to Japanese podcast, but the other podcasts that I listen to in my free time at 1.5 or 2 times speed, and it's made a huge difference in the number of podcasts I can get through, and hasn't really affected, I think, any of my enjoyment of them. Some of the ones that I really enjoy, I listen to at 1 time speed. So I would recommend listening to this podcast at 2 times speed, maybe except for the sections where I say anything in Japanese, so you can kind of rewind and slow those down and listen to them. But definitely do it at 1.5 or 2 times speed so you can get through this stuff and get on with your life. So that's my other recommendation for this month. We'll see you in August. Stay cool until then.